Welcome to the WAPPP webinar on a transnational PPP world, innovation, collaboration, and common prosperity, exploring North American projects. Allow me to share some webinar technicalities with you and present the sequence of events for the next 90 minutes. My name is Jean-Christophe Barth. I'm the Executive Director of WAPPP, and I'm very happy to join in from Geneva tonight to open this webinar. So the duration is of 90 minutes. We will record this webinar and it's scheduled to finish at 3:30 US time. We'll make the recording available on the WAPPP YouTube channel subsequently. The chat function is active for organizational questions. Please use the Q&A box for questions to the panelists. Questions from webinar participants are very welcome because they help us to guide the conversation, and we'll try to respond during the webinar. And should there be not be possible, we will give replies in writing later. For the sequence of events, our moderator will present each speaker ahead of the respective thematic presentation. After each short presentation, there will be ample time for a lively exchange with the webinar participants. So please make use of the Q&A box at any time. And WAPPP is happy to invite you to this webinar now, and I wish us a very lively and enriching debate on this highly topical issue. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to David Baxter, who's the chair of the North American chapter, for some introductory comments.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining this inaugural, I would say, North American chapter WAPPP seminar. It's the 10th in the series that we have done. And we have chosen a topic which is of great interest to the three main countries within the North American chapter of WAPPP, and that is Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It does also obviously include other nations such as the Caribbean English-speaking nations. So it's not there's no specific reason we left them out other than the fact that our main speakers, except for Maud, who is from the Global Infrastructure Hub, are also leaders of the North American chapter. The reason this topic came about was because we are faced with a major change in the government in the United States, and this has large ramifications for all of its neighbors, especially in the sense of trade, people movements, etc. And as you know, we can say that land or country borders are man-made, but geography unites them. You know, there are common rivers, there are common areas, geographic zones along the United States border. And the Mexican states that are up against the US border in the south are very integrated economically, as are the Canadian provinces that are up against the United States. So there's a lot of interconnections with infrastructure. And as the Biden administration launches its multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure bill that it's looking at, there have been numerous statements that public-private partnerships will play a role in this new initiative. And the result of that, obviously, will be transnational, transborder, international, however you wish to describe it, projects that could be PPPs that will transect across the borders. So there are great opportunities. The types of projects are anything from pipelines to power grid integration to roads, irrigation schemes. The opportunities are limitless. So I'm very excited to have everyone on board. You can see our speakers. There's Maud from the Global Infrastructure Hub. We have Oscar, who is the vice president of FEMCIC, which is the Federation of Mexican Engineers, a very, very august and large body. Wayne, who represents Canada from a perspective of from a financial perspective. And then we have Laurie Tannous, who is a very unique lawyer in the one sense, and that is she is an international transborder or transboundary lawyer. So I think we have got a nice team here. I'm going to briefly just give an outline. You can see that we will have a presentation from the Global Infrastructure, which will look at cross-border infrastructure projects based on a recent publication that they have put out. I'm not going to say anything more so that you can introduce it. We also have Oscar, who will talk about the projects from a perspective, of the US-Mexico border side. We have Wayne, who will talk from the US-Canada border side, and then Laurie Tannous, as I said, who will talk from it as a international, how would you put, legal side. So very interesting perspectives. So I'm going to introduce Maud. She is basically an extremely accomplished person, and I've had the pleasure of chatting to her a number of times. She works for the Global Infrastructure Hub, which is an initiative that was launched by the G20. She's seconded to the Global Infrastructure Hub by the French government. And so it's an awesome responsibility, but I think a very exciting experience for her. You can see she is the Director of Practical Tools and Knowledge at the Global Infrastructure Hub, and she's going to talk about this, these tools that are available, which are being developed. I wish my resume read as well as hers does, but she's also worked as, she's worked with ministries, as you can see. She's also worked as a legal advisor. She holds a master's degree in public economic law, and she from the University of Paris. So I'm going to say welcome, Maud, and I am going to put up your first slide so that you can go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, David, and thank you very much for your invitation. Hi, everyone. So that's a snapshot of the new guidance we just published a couple of weeks ago here at the Global Infrastructure Hub. So just a very, very quick introduction of the Global Infrastructure Hub. It's an international organization based in Sydney and in Toronto. We have two main offices, and we are supporting the G20 on the infrastructure agenda to drive an ambitious agenda on resilient, sustainable, and inclusive infrastructure through action-oriented program, capacity building, and infrastructure knowledge. So here it's one of the tools that we published alongside with other tools on the risk allocation, contract management, but also we do have a lot of tools around data with the global outlook and InfraCompass. But just on the connectivity across border, why it's an important topic. We could have thought that after, with the pandemic and the COVID and the closure of border, the cross-border infrastructure were quite challenges in a couple of places. But actually, cross-border infrastructure are more relevant than ever in a post-pandemic world and important for the recovery and all the recovery plans that are discussed for the recovery stimulus package. We're also working on the infra tracker, which is tracking the different recovery package around the globe. So the latest International Monetary Fund, IMF, and G20 surveillance note highlighted the need to support infrastructure in a coordinated action to maximize GDP growth and spillover. Cross-border projects seems to be a good target for realizing such a potential. These projects are complex, work across different jurisdictions, engage more stakeholders than traditional infrastructure projects, and carry on higher risk and cost, but they are very important for, of course, connectivity and economic growth, a wider effect like knowledge diffusion, technology transfer, and cultural exchanges between two countries, and of course, trade links and regional cooperation. Why we did this guidance? So this guidance was developed with Rumble, our consultant, and it presents a lot of global practices, examples that aims to answer to the question of how to develop, manage, and implement cross-border infrastructure, giving a lot of examples to policymakers and practitioners in managing the specific consideration arising for cross-border projects. You have here on the right side, and I will be very quick, but we have a lot of examples. 22 project policy or programs are showcasing in this guidance, as well as seven detailed case study, some more historic case studies such as the Channel Tunnel, but more recent ones such as the Gordie Howe International Bridge. But we do have also cross-border from all region, Africa, but also Australia, as well as Asia, as well as Europe, of course. So next slide, please. So the guidance highlight 5 key considerations through examples and lessons learned throughout the life cycle of a cross-border infrastructure project. So the first one, and you'll see a bit the classical order of the life cycle, you have one key consideration, which is adopting policy, planning and prioritization framework for an efficient regional cooperation. I will just give one example. In Europe, you have a wider framework that allow and facilitate cross-border infrastructure project, and that's all you know, the TNT-E and TNT framework, which are wider regional connection networks that are actually connecting different regions in Europe, and also allow some regulation, policy, and also funding when you actually realize those cross-border infrastructure within those networks. And we had a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and we highlight those networks with different European cross-border project interconnector in the energy or transport sector. And the second key consideration is creating legal, regulatory, and stakeholder alignment to enable cross-border delivery. So that's all about stakeholder alignment, very important between 2 or more countries. So there is also very important to have a shared vision between those 2 countries for a new infrastructure project. I can give and to have treaties between those 2 countries, such as, for example, the Treaty of Canterbury for the Channel Tunnel cross-border infrastructure. So then you have the third consideration is optimizing the financial structure to properly allocate risk and benefits. And a very quick word, but there is some specific risk for cross-border project on the top of the classical risk in any PPP concession or major infrastructure project. And those key risks are related to geopolitical risk, of course, currency risk, and other counterparty risk to better have a good structuration in the project. And then establishing effective governance structure. In a cross-border project, you have various type of contractual structure. Of course, you have an integrated international binational body, which encompass, which is on the top of the contractual structure. And then you have, of course, most of the time the SPV, and then sometimes you have different structures. Sometimes each country is doing its own procurement for the cross-border infrastructure. Sometimes it's more integrated frameworks I can develop later. And then the last point is the managing efficiency and efficiently the cross-border all along the operation, execution, construction, and operation stage. And of course, to have also cross-border bodies to do so is very important. Just give the example of the COVID and the Origen bridge to manage a specific safety or supply chain and also closure of border during the COVID time. So next slide, please. So just to highlight that, that's the highlight of one of the 7 deep dive case study. So for each case study, and I'm running almost out of time, so I will be very, very quick on this one. You have a snapshot of the actually key features of this case study. You have also the highlight, you have a map, and on the right side of the screen here, you can see all the different topics that we are covering in those deep dive case study, the project timeline, of course, policy and planning settings. I will just say a very quick word. There is, for this specific project that a lot of people around the table know much better than me, so I won't talk too long about it, but it's very, very interesting. A cross-border project, absolutely incredible bridge, and we can do we do have the other bridge, which is the Origen Bridge, very important to link two part of the border here between Canada and Michigan, so USA. And just one word is to say that those bridges are just creating a lot of enhancing all the economic on both sides of the border. The example with the Origen Bridge was that the Malmö region in Sweden was, after the connection with the bridge, the economic trade throughout the bridge were really developed on both sides of the border. And for this particular bridge, very interesting procurement process with the P3 contract developed by the WAPPP authority, which is the contracting authority. And on the top of that, there is, of course, a binational body with a representative from Canada and USA. But I think I'm over my time, so I will be very happy to take any question further on. But thank you very much, David.
Thank you very, very much, Maud. Very interesting. And thank you for giving us an international perspective as well. I am going to introduce Oscar, who is our representative from Mexico. He has many, many years of experience, 30 years, and I think him and I are cousins when it comes to that amount of years, so we'll keep that a little quiet to ourselves. He is the Vice President for International Relationships at FEMCIC, and he does a lot of cross-border collaboration with the United States. He's also in our leadership committee, the World Association of Public-Private Partnership Units and professionals. He's a committee of the a committee member of the American Public Works Association. He is very much focused on leading the charge with PPPs at FEMCIC. He is also involved in a number of other organizations. I know also he's truly international. He lives in Mexico and the United States. And also he's a member of the Society of American Civil Engineers. Welcome, Oscar. I'm going to hand over to you for your discussion.
Thank you, David. Good day to everybody. We got a convergence of three main things going on right now. Obviously, we have a new administration, the Biden administration, and I believe next week they're going to unveil their Build Back Better infrastructure plan. Like David mentioned, it's a multi-trillion approach. As you can see, part of the discussion with this infrastructure plan involves the sustainable and clean energy and climate change. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that plan and how that plays with another important factor, which was the American Society of Civil Engineers, which I'm a member. Every 4 years, they have a report card. So we just have this hot off the press a couple of weeks ago. And there's some good news and some bad news. I always tend to see things with opportunities. The good news is that actually there has been a slight improvement since 2017. The last 2017 report card got a grade of D+. So that's a failing grade, close to a failing grade for those who remember the college days, and which is not too good. The good news is that right now it's C-, so there's a slight improvement on that. But that doesn't mean that we are doing a good job. It only means that we need to catch up. There is a very, very large infrastructure gap that needs to be addressed. $2.6 trillion over the next 10 years, roughly about $260 billion each year, in order to catch up with the aging infrastructure that it's coming to the end of the life cycle. Most of it's 40, even 50 years old. And like everything, even though there's maintenance, the concept of asset management and how you deal with it needs to be incorporated. We need to rescue some of that infrastructure, maybe some of those brownfield projects can be turned into redevelopment opportunities, I will say. So that's an important factor. You know, the transportation situation in the United States right now, the Biden administration is really pushing hard for rail. I've seen that the situation with Amtrak and obviously high-speed rail, which is very far behind a lot of countries in the world. High-speed rail, I think, is going to be a very important factor in how we move people and goods. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm actually also proposing, this report card addresses ports, waterways, highways, wastewater treatment plants, all types of infrastructure, but it doesn't include the border. So I'm actually proposing through FEMCIC and the American Society that hopefully the next report card, we incorporate a grade for the border infrastructure. I think it's important, and I'll talk to you a little bit about later. And then the third leg of this is the U.S., Mexican, Canada Accord that David mentioned, that it was a replace NAFTA, the original accord signed in 1994, which has successfully integrated the economies of Canada, United States, and Mexico, and the impact on the borders. It was replaced and got into place in July 2020. But like every relationship, there is a rebuilding part. You know, the rebuilding the complex, especially the relationship between U.S. and Mexico. And what does that mean? You know, we hear a lot of things about the border. Some things are positive, some things are negative, but the implications, I think, can be resolved to having a great infrastructure development. And that's going to be one of the proposals we're working on. How can we leverage our opportunities to really improve the infrastructure on the U.S.-Mexican border and create an economic zone that really prospers and brings well-being to everybody? Obviously, trade is very important. How can we tie in all those logistic integrations that there is a proposal, for example, of a big project coming from Mazatlan, Mexico, a port, and it will go all the way to Canada, I believe Ontario, and it involves ports, rail, obviously cross-border, intermodal. So it's a very interesting proposal. It's about a $10 billion project. Next one, I'm going to talk about the challenges and opportunities of the border infrastructure. Like I said before, there is a big infrastructure gap in finance alternatives. The United States finance a lot of projects to municipal bonds. There's a thing called private activity bonds that also is there that I think the Biden administration is looking to expand. Those are infrastructure bonds that are tax-free. So one of the proposals they're working at is to have a national infrastructure fund that will be through a PPP. It will be funded seed money to the private sector. And that way we can use private activity bonds to finance projects around the United States. The United States has a very distinct approach to infrastructure versus Mexico, I want to say, because it's very decentralized. Most of the decision-making, it's at the local level, maybe state. The federal level is just policy and big picture items, versus in Mexico where everything's kind of tops down, you know, the decision-making goes out. So that in a place, that it's a complexity when you're trying to do border infrastructure projects because the stakeholders involved and who's talking to who, it's very important to have that well coordinated. And there are some, the governments that I can tell you, there are some efforts on doing that. Obviously, we already have in place several tools such as the border master plan. Each state has a border master plan. We also have one thing called borders and crossings. It deals with all the border crossings. We got the border governors. We got the good neighbor policy by the EPA. And we got NatBank, you know, the North American Development Bank, which is something that was created for environmental projects around the US and Mexico. But we have different laws, you know. The United States is a common law, and and the Mexico is civil law. So that in itself is another layer of complexity. I'm sure Laurie, being the legal expert, will talk about that. But coordination is the effort. Stakeholder involvement is very important, and the integration of this value chains. The next one, please. And finally, this is the opportunity. We've been working diligently for some years, the engineers, I will go, on having a more proactive approach on leveraging the infrastructure development and the US-Mexican border. By creating a energy corridor where we can have renewable energy projects linked up with water. You know, this area is pretty arid, but we have oceans. We can build desalination plants that can feed and irrigate those areas and also help with the agriculture. Obviously, trade is very important. So we built up the agent cross-border infrastructure and the integration logistically, but also the situation with resilience. We've been talking with the Institute of Sustainable Infrastructure, Envision. I happen to be the representative for Mexico for that, through FEMCIC, and how important it is to have a very resilient infrastructure. You know, what the situation that just happened in Texas with the climate change and how the impacts to the energy grid was because of the cold weather. But it had a domino effect to Mexico because 80% of the gas comes from Texas. So we have a lot of combined cycle projects in Mexico to generate electricity, especially in the northern parts where they were impacted. So that's something to take into consideration how things are working on. So that's why the proposal is to build a resilient, sustainable border area that includes a duty-free zone. I think improve trade, leverage the US-Mexican-Canada border, improve infrastructure, and coordinate that with a triple P approach. One proposal we're working on WAPPP is to integrate a border P3 unit, cross-border P3 unit between all the US states and the Mexican states. And I'm looking forward to discussing that later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Extremely interesting. And I'm glad you did point out the interdependence of Texas and Mexico. Mexico calls itself the Lone Star State, but it does have neighbors, and the snowstorm was catastrophic for northern Mexico as well. I'm going to introduce Wayne Colins. He is based in Canada. He's the Canadian mouth of this presentation. One of them, we have two Canadians. Wayne is a consultant. He's based in Ontario, Canada, and he is the founder of Origen Financial Management Services. His work is, I think, in a way, cutting edge, and he's provided a lot of valuable insights and projects with distinctive PPP elements in them. He is also in the leadership of WAPPP for North America, and he works with other organizations as well. So we are pleased to have him. You can see he's worked with WAPPP, AFA, IFMA, Pro-FMI, there's a lot of acronyms there. And I'm going to hand over to Wayne, and let's hear what he has to say.
Thanks very much, David. Yeah, I've been fortunate to work in many different facets of projects, certainly in the public-private partnership world as well, specifically Canada and their role in the PPP world. It's got quite a long history coming back from in Canada from 1990, thereabouts, and certainly a long history of working with Canada and the US together, and that is the same in the public-private partnership context. Since that time, we've had over 220 projects Canada has successfully implemented. Certainly its participation on the world stage as well as domestically is known, and certainly the model that works. To take off from what Oscar was saying about how it works in the United States here, they have at the federal level, they have certain initiatives, but they're funding infrastructure projects like the recent funding announced for the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, which is a relatively new entity, but same initiative, it just changed the name. And there was $10 billion announced to contribute to that. initiative moving forward. Certainly on the provincial level, so as opposed to the state level, provincial level, you see a lot here, and particularly in my experience in Ontario was Infrastructure Ontario has done a lot of those, primarily in the healthcare sector, and now we're getting into the transportation, which is a major initiatives. As you can see by the percentage of what we have for active projects, it's pretty substantial for the size of the country of Canada. And healthcare has always been the focus, and I can think of some just close to home here in the Toronto area, as well as out in Western Canada, that are really good projects. And of course, transportation. I was fortunate to be involved in the Eglinton Crosstown LRT project, which started a few years ago when I was actually doing work with ACON at the time, and then there's a consortium, Elliston, and other countries involved, companies involved. And now that's coming to fruition, and it's nice to see these things. They take time, but it's nice to see a consistent effort of all the different parties contributing to these successes. So that's where we're at. Certainly, the next few slides just basically underlining the themes of this webinar as such. So I'll focus on innovation and just kind of some highlights of projects where that's very relevant. The Champlain Bridge in Montreal, Quebec was a great project that was many years in the making. It's finally come to fruition, and some innovative things there. Won't get into all the technical details. Folks like Oscar and other people on the engineering side could appreciate much fuller and expand on that much more than I could. But essentially, there was a lot of thought that went into it. It wasn't just building a new bridge. It was, how do we make this better? How do we learn from lessons learned from, the previous life cycle analysis was done from older, assets that certainly survived their lifetime, but there was, how can we make this better? So some of the technologies, things were incorporated. So the concrete and the steel, that you use stainless steel rebar, and some of the really exposed sections, de-icing, exposed to de-icing, and also in the logistics and assembly, instead of trying to do it all on site, how could that be, a hybrid approach of doing some off-site, then transporting it, assembling components, and then some on-site. And certainly in the coatings and that paint system, that was another key element, and the drainage too. There again, all of these things taken into consideration. So really a lot of lessons learned from projects, not all just on this particular location, but around the world. And then on innovation, on some of the milestones, incentives for the partners, so that it's a long-term project, of course, the DBFOM. So to make it worthwhile and really good for everybody, which it should be. So essentially, that was a good example of how innovation was applied in this particular example. Collaboration, that's another key element that's just as important. Everybody brings something to the table, and certainly I think it's important that there's a clear understanding, and these projects are very complex. So there's hundreds of pages of legal agreements and service level expectations and things that have to be met. And the agreements in this case were just highlighting the Gordie Howe, and I'm fortunate to have co-panelists that has got much more experience than myself. Laurie, she's going to jump in on, can expand on some of the this particular project, which is a great project, which Maud mentioned, is the Gordie Howe Bridge and Windsor, Detroit. And that's a good example of Canada-US, where there's really good interaction and benefits. This is a very vital transportation link. It's the busiest commercial land border in Canada and the US. It actually represents 25% of all trade. So it's certainly, it has a lot of significance, and transitioning to do that is something that is a major feat. And it has 2.5 million trucks that cross every year. So a lot of traffic. So looking at an asset that's going to be there for a long time, which is going to be serve their needs. And certainly the agreement there, again, a good example of working together was Canada, the Windsor Detroit Bridge Authority, the WDBA, and the state of Michigan. Maybe just let Laurie can comment on her experience, because she's actually dealt directly with this project. Okay, we'll pick that up after. The other one is common prosperity. Basically there again, it's got to be good for everybody. So it's a thing called community benefit agreements. It's not just building infrastructure wherever it might be. This example here is in Alberta in Western Canada, hydroelectric instead of a bridge this time. Essentially another vital infrastructure project, but it's got to be good for everybody. So there was major investment that was done, thought gone into who's, you know, the area that it's in and how it benefits the local communities. In this case, it's a developer worked very closely and awarded $85 million worth of contracts. They typically try to do that as well, but in this case, it was very significant because of the location. And certainly there's other types of examples. I won't get into it for brevity of time, but essentially what community benefits, if you're going to do a project, it's not just fulfilling the needs of this particular project. It's not getting just buy-in, it's the people long-term benefits. And so it's sort of leveraging the sort of investment, if you will, to look at not just this particular asset, but the community. And these are legally binding and enforceable. And this was the first major infrastructure example of this not too long ago in 2010 at the Vancouver Olympic Bridge Village when they actually implemented this. So it's basically to share the benefits of the infrastructure, but look at the community as well. And that's basically the three elements. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. That was very insightful. And I think one thing that's also important that can be pointed out, when we talk about trans-border, we could also talk about trans-jurisdictional border projects. So in the United States, which operates as, you know, essentially 50 countries with each, you know, state unit, that many of these complexities of building projects across state boundaries, and I know in Canada, even across provincial boundaries, can result in the same sort of challenges, especially in decentralized governments like or countries like the United States, where states have tremendous power and, you know, don't always have to submit to the central government's guidance. So just a very, very interesting perspective. I'm going to hand over, sorry, this slide jumped, and we're going to have Laurie Tannous, who is an exciting find for us in the sense of that she is actually a trans-border legal expert and has worked on, I believe, 2 projects that she's going to talk about briefly that were, you know, the bridge we talked about on the Canadian border, but she's also going to talk about one on the US-Mexico border. Laurie is, as I said, a cross-border attorney. She has done a lot of interesting work when it comes to cross-border management, immigration, customs, trades, and services. She works as a special advisor on border security, which is also an element that is of great concern often to these transnational projects. She's the vice president of government relations at Faro Canada, and she also has a company of her own, Tannous and Associates, that she works with. So I'm not going to spoil the fun and ramble on. I'm going to hand over to you, Laurie, with your presentation.
Thank you, David, and thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon and this morning for those that had to wake up quite early to be with us here today. So yes, I have a very different or unique, if we want to call it that, background in that I'm not part of a large firm that just focuses on you know, PPEs, but because of my expertise on border security, immigration, and customs, I've been asked to assist on some of these different P3 projects, and I kept thinking, okay, what were some of the biggest roadblocks or stumbling blocks that we had, and how did we solve for those problems? So I'm going to try and talk about some of that today. I think just in summary, some of the legal constraints of PPEs are that you've got competing and conflicting interests of various stakeholders. And just like my co-panelists talked about today, when I was first asked to come and work as a legal advisor to the WDBA, specifically on the issue of land acquisition, this was interesting for me because you've got the United States and Canada. In Canada, it's called expropriation. In the United States, it's called eminent domain. So right then and there, before you even get started, you've got these differences in the way that land is acquired for these types of projects. And so that's one example of just sort of wrapping your mind around it and working with the various legal and other advisors to say, okay, this is the problem. How are we going to address it and get past it? Same thing with the border security. I mean, I was an officer, I was a customs and immigration officer, prior to becoming an attorney. And so I understand sort of the risks as it relates to what can come across that border, even just in the building phases of it, right? So those are other considerations that have to be taken into effect. And then of course, and you know, Oscar mentioned it, the differences between common and civil law. So we are both common law in Canada and the US, but our laws are very different in some respects and in some aspects. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about, you know, some of the hurdles, right? So you've got a situation where in the United States, the current bridge, the Ambassador Bridge, that's owned by a private family, and this is the only border crossing in North America that's privately owned. So whereas in Canada, if you need to acquire land for a project like this that is of public interest, like the Gordie Howe, you go about the steps and you do that. In the United States, it's a little different. You can't just grab that land or take that land. There are various steps, and you know, we were able to work. I personally was able to work with the Michigan Department of Transportation, the different attorney generals on that project. But what, you know, I don't know that everybody took into consideration the fact that there were going to be some legal battles because that bridge was owned by a private company, okay, by a private family, I should say, not a private company. You know, so you've got this this hurdle. How do you come over it? In the United States, what they say is, look, if you're going to acquire land for the purposes of this public interest, which that was the first battle, and happy to share any of the cases for those that want to see at every single level within Michigan and what happened with that. And I wasn't a litigator, but I was in the background scenes. But at the end of the day, if I'm going to summarize it into a golden nugget, if you're going to take someone's land, especially in Michigan, and in this case, you've got to make them whole. So then the challenge, if you will, was how do we make this family or this private company whole because we're taking their land for this project, right? And so that's where those stakeholder consultations come in that my co-panelists have talked about, where working with, you know, team members from both sides of the country to say what's important to the constituents and to everybody here, right? So that's, you know, one example. When we're talking about the regulatory issues, and I think Wayne mentioned that, and so did Maud and Oscar, but that's another issue, not just in terms of what are you going to get across the border, but now you've got a bridge, how do you staff that bridge? So I was fortunate enough to be able to, on that project and likely on the next project between Mexico and the US, is working with these customs agencies to say, okay, how many customs border services officers are we going to need to be able to staff this border crossing, right? How do we make sure it's a secure crossing? And so those are other issues. And how do you get over that? It's really being able to have that dialogue to see what the benchmark is right now, where are we at now, to know where you need to go. And so you can go to the next slide, please, David. So, you know, I continue to work on the Gordie Howe Bridge, but mainly from an economic development perspective, not a legal perspective at this point. And I think because of the work there, it led my company, Tannous and Associates, to be able to have the opportunity to work on the Otay Mesa port of entry project that I think Oscar was referring to. Again, another joint collaborative project between two different countries that is needed. You know, when we talk about these projects, for me, obviously, my passion is on cross-border projects, and so when you see that you can put together a project like this that will increase economic growth, that will increase binational trade, and so again, in this, and you can go to the next slide, please. So some of the things that we're working on here in terms of is saying, all right, how do we see where we're at today, and then what is it that we need to do, and then having all of the right legal and other experts around. There's laws, yes, there's regulations, there's policies, and that's black and white, but sometimes we just need to live in the gray, and we need to find creative and innovative solutions to get us to the other side of what it is that we're trying to do. And so, you know, looking at different considerations, thinking outside of the box is what helps these types of projects get to where they need to go. So I could talk all day on this, but I'm not going to take any more time. I think I've given as much of a summary as I can. So back to you, David.
Thank you, Laurie. I think one thing that's absolutely critically important that you pointed out, when we talk about cross-border infrastructure, we rely on the engineers, we rely on the politicians, rely on all sorts of things, but we forget, and that, just the light bulb went off on my head, is the management and operations of that facility, especially when it's a transnational one, because there's multiple jurisdictions, multiple constraints. Policing, I mean, it's an international border. You have to have some sort of policing. And then this isn't a situation like the EU, maybe, where the border movement is more lax because there's a Schengen agreement and everyone has the same sort of practice within. These are unique differences. And, one thing that's going to be critically important when you have public-private partnerships, is to win political support. And, you're going to have two groups here when it's a transnational. It's not just politicians in one country, it's politicians in two countries. And protecting, as you talked about sustainability, the long-term approach. We don't want to have a project that's going to fail when a government changes and suddenly is against the project. And then you're sitting with a piece of infrastructure that, you can't, suddenly somebody blocks it, the worst case scenario, which is a disaster. We're going to enter into the question and answer session. I'm going to, there is a question, and it's directed at you, Maud, and I'm going to give you the first chance because I know sitting in Sydney, it's a completely different time zone and on the other side of the world. And the question to you, Maud, is, this comes from Tabang Lisbon Raquena, I believe from South Africa. Is just wondering how feasible it is to implement cross-border PPPs when you are faced with non-macroeconomic convergence, as in Africa, with widespread currency risks. It's very technical, I hope you understand it, but I believe that the focus is, how do you handle currency risks?
Yeah, that's a challenging question. I guess, yes. And yeah, well, we have a couple of examples in the different case study that we develop on the currency risk, because of course, in the European project, you don't have this question because it's all euro within. So, but of course, between two different countries that have not the same currency risk, you do have this issue. I know that, for example, in the Gordie Howe bridge, there were different mechanisms within the contract to manage this risk, depends in which stage it is. So there is all the interest rate and the currency evolution during all the procurement process. So I think in the Gordie Howe, the Canadian government actually covered the difference of between the submission and the first proposal and the financial clause, where there were some currency evolution, and so that was mainly taken by the government, and then depends, because in a lot of cross-border projects, you actually at the procurement process, you do have contract which is done by each countries. So for example, so you have a joint authority on the top. You can have government to cover this risk at early stage until the financial close, and then you have mechanism within the contract to actually manage this risk at later stage, or you have actually procurement contracts that are running by each of the different countries. So you actually in the local currency, and depends then if you have foreign investors coming to this project to build a foreign consortium, and then you can have hedging mechanism again with some government support or multilateral organization support, because in a lot of also emerging country, you do have a very important actor, which we didn't talk a lot here, but to provide some guaranteed type of support, it's of course the MDBs that are here to provide this support. So I guess it's just a couple of things, but there is more in the guidance on this question.
I just have a, thank you very much. A question, maybe Laurie and Oscar. Has the issue of currency risk been raised from a Canadian perspective and as well as a Mexican perspective? Because we have quite different currencies that at times have been quite volatile against one another. So maybe Oscar first and then Laurie second. And you unmute, Oscar.
Yes, well, I'm very familiar with the project that Laurie talked about. I'm actually collaborate with the California Department of Transportation, so I'm not at liberty to talk too much in detail about it. But whatever is public, I can talk. There's always a risk for currency. However, there's always agreements, high-level agreements. In this case, in that particular project, there is a bilateral agreement that the tolling will be done in the United States. It's a dynamic tolling. It's a model based on the demand of the asset. And it will be integrated to one thing called Intelligent Transportation System. So basically, you're going to measure the volume of transit on both sides. I'm talking primarily from Mexico, especially the trucks. And so you will make a decision with that dynamic toll to cross the border. Yes, it will be in dollars. And there is a split already in place, an agreement. I'm not at liberty to tell you what the percentage are, but there is an agreement to repay this to the bonding that the U.S., at least on the U.S. side and part of Mexico, is doing with this project. You know, this project is unique because it's a kind of like a hybrid between a public-private partnership. It's more a public-public project. On the Mexican side, there is a P3 group that it's working on it to build up the infrastructure. Obviously, right now they're in the process of acquiring the right of way. On the U.S. side, they're already well ahead. But there is high-level commitments to have this open by the year 2024, I believe is the last date. So there's always that risk. But whenever you have an agreement, and that's something more legal ramifications, you assume the risk. Each country assumes that risk. Obviously, Mexico, United States, the economies are, there's a big gap as far as the political risk and also financial risk. But in this case, I think the benefits outweigh the risk. All on the U.S.-Mexican border, we got 32 ports of entry. Some of them are very old. Some of them are new, brand new, like this one that's being built. And also in Mexicali, there's a couple new ones. So there is an opportunity to leverage. And they did mention about the multi-level effect. You got the General Service Administrations, the Customs and Border. So you got a lot. I do want to talk about a particular project that I was involved, that it's already in place and it's very successful, P3. That was a airport border crossing bridge over here in Tijuana. The Tijuana airport is right at the border with the United States. On the other side is Otay, precisely. And I worked on that bridge with the Mexican, as a consultant with the Mexican. And that's a very interesting project. It was, it's a pedestrian bridge that links the airport on the Mexican side and the US side to a hub. And it really alleviates also the airport capacity of San Diego. It was supposed to be, it's a 20-year concession. And obviously with the tolls you pay the customs and border, and you pay the immigration and everything on both sides. And it's such a successful bridge because the break-even point was at the 10 years. And it was a 2-year break-even point. So that in itself gives you an opportunity. And NatBag was involved because we also linked it up with the opportunity to reduce the transportation vehicles and contamination of the air. And we use some of the funds that were from NatBank. So that's my experience as far as that.
Oscar, I think that's an important point that you've made, because as border trade increases and economic collaboration increases and there is then a greater potential for these projects to be paid off ahead of schedule if there's a greater use than was expected. And so, maybe PPPs aren't dead, as some people are saying, but just, have a great opportunity. Laurie, could you give us some perspectives?
Sure. I think Maud covered some of the things that I would have mentioned in terms of the agreements that are in place, right? So typically in any sort of international trade agreement with a supply chain or differing countries, part of what's taken into consideration is what the currency is today and what it could be at the time of close. And so all of those agreements are typically what's in place. And then to Oscar's point, same type of model is going to be there from an ITS, so that intelligent transportation systems from a tolling perspective. Right now, even, and I get asked this question all the time, if you go to the United States, okay, you must pay your toll in Canadian, right? And when you come back, you pay your toll in US, and you have the option at both crossings, right? So when you're entering, are you paying in US dollars or are you paying in Canadian dollars? And so, I think that even, from a collection of toll on the Gordie Howe, you're going to see that same type of model, right? Where do you want to pay in US dollars? Do you want to pay in Canadian dollars? And that hedging is being taken into consideration in those behind the scenes agreements to adjust, if you will, for the risk.
Thank you. Tabang, I hope that gave you some opportunities of understanding. In Africa, there are African countries that have very strong economies and their neighboring countries have very poor economies. And this is a reality, especially with fluctuations. And, was the contract floated in US dollars? And, if there's a massive fluctuation, that can have bad impacts. So, and Tabang, you know where to reach some of these people if you want to have a conversation and ask them specifically. Amol asks a question: what are the key principles for dividing the funding or costs of a cross-border project? I think we've touched on that, but maybe what you call it, Laurie, do you have any ideas just on the key principles and how these decisions are made on how you would share the cost across borders?
Well, it depends, right? And in terms of the Gordie Howe example, which that's been very public knowledge, that the agreement was the Canadian government was going to pay for it, and then repaid back in the tolling situation, right? So I think it really depends on the two countries that you're talking about, what the need is. There was a lot of resistance for this project in Michigan and in the United States. There was sort of this if you will, sentiment that there is a bridge, there is a tunnel. What do we need another crossing for? And so when you have that sentiment, you don't have that buy-in. That's where things like community benefits and taking into consideration social and environmental needs of the communities come into play. And so you have to say, okay, what does the Southwest Detroit community need? What does the Southwest Windsor community need? And then how do we say, all right, who's going to pay for what? Whether it's from a, and then the other issue, at least in this case, the crossing cost is one thing. What held up negotiations, and delayed some of it was who was going to pay for the customs plazas, right? So the Canadian government had agreed to pay for the crossing, agreed to pay for the Canadian Customs Plaza, but there was no agreement in place initially that it was going to pay for the US Customs CBP Plaza. That was also an issue. So when you're looking at this, I think you almost have to pretend you're in a helicopter and looking down at a crash site to say, okay, I am assessing everything, and where is the biggest fire, or where do I need to go to first? But don't forget that you've got these other smaller fires burning, and how are you going to address them, right? So I don't know that necessarily answers the question, but it depends on the project and the complexity of it and where each part of that project is actually physically going to be located.
So I think one takeaway from this is that no project is the same. Every project has different priorities, countries have different priorities, different needs, and both parties have to be cognizant of this and try and reach the middle ground so that there can be a consensus that is reached. Otherwise, the project's not going to happen, essentially. And so it's very interesting. I had forgotten that Canada was generous enough to actually be the main financial contributor to the project. And that's very magnanimous of them, because I don't think there are many countries in the world who would do that. But I know it was critical for the Canadian economy for this bridge to be upgraded. And such a focus with, you said, 25% of the border traffic going through that area for Canada, which was not maybe the case for the United States. So prioritization. I know we're getting onto the hour and more. I'm going to ask, one other question, and then maybe even if you, at that stage, if you do want to drop off, you can feel comfortable after that. But if you want to hang on, that is great as well. Domingo Penalvar asked this question. I was wondering whether our experts have in mind whether it is possible to mitigate social and economic redistribution effects between the two parts of the border. Very often countries are not fully aligned in socioeconomic terms. And he says, I'm thinking on the Mexican and US situation, for example, a cross-border project like an international bridge may increase attractiveness for people to look for opportunities where economics work better. So I think what he's talking about is, the economics and the benefits and the ripple effects, etc. Do you have any comments on that, Maud, for us?
Yes, we do have a couple of examples in the guidance on this. Of course, cost-benefits analysis. There is cost-benefits analysis at the starting point of any cross-border infrastructure project, and then the social benefit can be different, as you just mentioned, between those two countries. But usually it's just a development of the maybe less advanced country to more economic development. And we have been seeing that in many projects. There is the N4 toll road that we mentioned in the guidance in Africa between Mozambique and South Africa. There were two different economies development. And of course, each time you have those cross-border, it's actually develop the region which is less developed. I can say another one which is in Europe, but it's not the same, of course, type of development, but between Malmö region in Sweden and Copenhagen in Denmark. And so of course, the Malmö region also, there were an economic development and a lot of worker between those two parts. And so all the region in Malmö were really developed afterwards. And so of course, social and development, economic development are taken into consideration. I mean, in the modelization, in the cost and benefits analysis, and it's real. A lot of the time you can see actually that it's even more social and economic benefits after the completion of the cross-border infrastructure, and of course trades is developed, economic. So it's quite wide effect, and we do have a couple of examples. So I invite you to, yeah.
Thank you, Maud. And I'm going to thank you now so that if you do drop off, at least you are recognized. Thank you for the Global Infrastructure Hub's effort to really produce an excellent resource that can be used by people who are grappling with these questions. I saw the presentation you did about 2 weeks ago, and it was fascinating. And I'm so glad that we've been able to carry on this conversation through the collaboration of the Global Infrastructure Hub and WAPPP. So you can feel guiltless now if you want to. If you want to log off, that's fine. And thank
you very much. Thank you very much. I think I will stay, but I will just put my camera off. Thank you very much.
Okay, then, thank you. If you want to put your head down on your desk, it's fine with us. David Reynolds, I see you've raised your hand. Could you just send us the question in the chat box? Ziad, sorry, one thing I did want to ask Oscar, you had mentioned that you were going to look at the idea of an economic free zone, along the Mexican, or you can maybe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but whatever it was called. Do you think that would mitigate some of the social and economic redistribution effects between Mexico and the United States? How would the free zone or the economic free zone balance things out?
Well, that's something that's already on the Mexican side in place. The Mexican government, this administration, the new administration, the AMLO administration is called, one of the first actions was to create not necessarily it's called a free trade zone, but it is a special zone where you have special tax considerations, especially income tax, and you got other opportunities to leverage the border areas. But our proposal, and I'm talking about the engineering community, the civil engineering proposal, we've been discussing this for, like I said, 3 or 4 years, is to leverage that and to create, and that's a big lift. It's a proposal, but obviously at the higher level, at the federal level with the United States and Mexico, I think let's work on synergetic effects. The border in Mexico and the United States has a distinct flavor. The past administration, the federal United administration in the States, they emphasize security, building a fence. We're making a little bit more friendly approach, let me call it that way, a situation where we include people first. I think one of the discussions on the questions that Domingo made about making intergenerational effects and such is very important. Those tools, and hopefully those tools can be implemented, but have the people center first. Wayne mentioned something that caught my attention: community benefit agreement. I think we can create that also along the U.S.-Mexican border. Certainly, there is a big gap as far as economic development on the Mexican side. We still have lagging infrastructure in a poor country. So why not create projects that are broader in scope, that brings economic and social and well-being to the communities? And that can be done through infrastructure and that free zone that I mentioned. One proposal, and I think WAPP will take certain leadership, is how do we coordinate the border states on the U.S. side, which is more difficult than the Mexican side. The Mexicans, it's more like a federal thing, to create a unit that helps facilitate this. And that's something that I think WAPP can take a leadership to create a P3 unit cross-border element that we can promote that trade in an orderly way. And another thing that's very important is how we leverage the sustainability effect through this tool called Ambition. It's very important tool because if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. So it's a tool that incorporates a lot of the concepts we've been talking about: people first, sustainability, resilience, but put it in the tool. And I think that should be part of your project delivery tool when you implement this kind of projects. I hope that answers your question, David.
Thank you, Oscar. Wayne, I don't want to forget you. You've been very silent and very magnanimous.
Not at all.
The question, in the sense of, where you talked about the CBA, the community-based agreement, and maybe that also ties a bit into Domingo's question of, the economic and social redistribution, elements of that, because there's got to be benefit for both parties and both countries and both communities on that. And if I correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that 80% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the American border or the United States border. And this definitely, anything that happens in the United States has an economic effect on Canada and vice versa. So any ideas or thoughts you could share with us in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that certainly lends itself well to that collaboration and certainly framework that would facilitate in that happening. I mean, these aren't new. It's evolved over time. And I was actually reading in the chat, there's a good comment someone had put in about saying, it's very challenging and it's, it can be enormous. And that's true. It depends. Every situation is different, as we've said. Every project is different, and certainly the location. Although I would say the one I mentioned was in a domestic situation example, but it's really, whether it's two countries or two parties, essentially it's the same thing. It's everybody that's party to an agreement or a project that they benefit. So in this case, it's in the context of transborder. You raise a good point about just by virtue of the demographics and the numbers that, the chances are everybody has a vested interest, they're going to be more actively engaged. That said, I guess it's really just the drive to ensure that this mechanism is basically, it's not sort of an optional thing. If you because these agreements, and Laurie could comment on that much more than I could, but they're not just nice to have it that they're in there, and then if they don't abide by them once the main project is done, it falls by the wayside. No, these have teeth in them and they're enforceable. So these community benefit agreements aren't just little side agreements. They're just as integral as the actual project agreement itself. They're comprise part of it. I really just think it's really just the best interest of all parties to making it work, and that drives from the key stakeholders to everybody involved to make sure that that there is a win-win situation. There has to be some give and take and some accommodation to make it viable. You don't really look at something in isolation for, people that are just going to be benefiting, and then other stakeholders aren't going to be affected by it. So that's really not the case. It takes work, and it's evolved over time. I think we're better now than we were, years ago when they first came. But I'm sure there's some that have challenges, and there again, it's the people that are involved. Laurie could speak to that when it comes to negotiations and sticky situations, and when it comes to legal ramifications, very complex. So I think that there again, it's the people that are pushing this mandate forward that make the difference to this coming to fruition, to success.
Thank you, Wayne. And we've always got to remember that these projects are being done because of people, not the other way around. So that's, we forget that often. Engineers want to build it, people want to do it, but have we consulted with the communities? Are we introducing elements of, for example, people first, public-private partnerships in? Are we looking at value for people? Are we looking at value for the future? Laurie, there's a question from Ziad Hayek, who is the leader of WAPPP globally. He asked the question, are dispute resolution boards used in some of the projects that were mentioned? And maybe Oscar, you also have something, but I know, Laurie, you were very involved in the legal aspects of that, and international disputes on an international project could, I think could be quite hairy and scary. So your thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, certainly. Good question. And Wayne alluded to it in terms of the agreements, right? So at least, on a couple of the projects, you've got the overarching agreement, between an international agreement between the two countries that says, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And there's definitely a mechanism for dispute resolution, right? And whether it's on the construction, dealing with who is actually going to be building that bridge, where the electricians are going to come from, whether it's Canada, whether it's the United States, what kind of labor is going to be used, what kind of materials, the makeup of the materials, right? So the rules of origin. I mean, in every aspect of the build all the way along, there is a mechanism for that resolution, right? To resolve whatever that problem may be. And in any of these situations, at least that I've been in, and you've got participants from both countries, Canada and the US, or like me, both, right? So you've got the right people around the table to try and resolve those issues, and then your fallback is to use a board or to use the arbitrator or whoever it is that has been appointed in the agreement. And Oscar, I'm sure you can speak more to that. I'll let you do so.
Oscar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laurie. Well, that's a very interesting question, actually dear to my heart. I am involved a lot in dispute resolution from the technical point. The dispute review boards is a very interesting tool to be incorporated in contracts. Like everything's about contract management. And when we do execute a construction contract, you better have those dispute review board included. So because you're not building a watch, you're building a big infrastructure. So it's going to be dispute between the contractor and the authorities, and with delays, all cost overruns, a lot of situations. So I think it's a good tool to have. It can be binding or non-binding. That's up to the agreement when it's signed, obviously. But it can have very helpful, especially if you go later on to arbitration. Now, also, we got to remember, once the asset is constructed, we need to maintain it and have it operational. So a performance dispute report is very important, because especially if you're going to be paying to availability payments, you need a government part that can be handling those disputes if the asset is available or not. So, and especially tolls are involved. So I think that's another important thing. And like everything, you got right now acts of God and situations that are out of the ordinary with this pandemic. How does that handle? I think a lot of the contracts are going to be renegotiated, frankly, because that was not included in the original premise when things were signed. But moving forward, having those boards included on can be very helpful. And like I said, the devil's in the detail. and that's more to the legal mind. I'm an engineer, but it is important to have that third-party government that can help you facilitate and manage the projects.
Thank you, Oscar. Dr. Irfan Al-Hassani from the United Arab Emirates has a very interesting question. We've talked here about the aspects of the special purpose vehicle, the project company, regarding disputes, agreements, et cetera, et cetera. Are there any other aspects of PPPs that also drive the considerations of collaboration across borders? I'll leave that to all three of you to comment, and if no one does, then I'll pick on one of you.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, so we've been very focused on the legal agreements, the special purpose vehicle, the company, the legal, that. Are there other aspects that can, for PPPs, that can drive this need or this interest in collaboration across the border?
I think the aspects of coordinating is very important, and understanding cultural differences is also very important. And in particular, United States and Mexico, we have a long history and different cultures, different situations as far as how we value things, but it doesn't mean we cannot come to agreements. And like everything, the respect is the most important thing. So we got a 2,000-mile border between the United States and Mexico, and we've been working over the last 30 years with the NAFTA and now the U.S.-Mexican-Canada Accord. Let's work continuously improving that. I think the world is getting divided in blocks, so we need to coordinate the effects and those synergetic process they can have, especially along the border. And look at what's happening over there with the United States and Canada with that Gaudi bridge, where the Canada had a vested interest because it was part of their main economic development. So I'll let Wayne talk because I've been talking a lot, but I think that's important, the coordination and the collaboration.
Thank you, Oscar. Wayne?
Yeah, I agree, Oscar. Certainly it's everybody's got a stake, and I think it's coming to common ground in some respects, but certain give and take, like on certain sides where there's you look at the history too. So sometimes there's maybe more give than take from a certain party. It's not always just exactly directly proportional or straightforward. It's really how do you, in a reasonable fashion, of course, but how do you accommodate a particular party, and how do you incentivize a party to sort of agree to move forward? They're going to want certain conditions met or certain things that are specific to that particular party. That said, it's certainly it's in everybody's best interest. Usually, the stick is to have the project move forward, but the opportunity is now. So when you're coming to negotiations or of that nature, you don't sort of defer to later. So that's why some people, they pretty hard positions until, you have some kind of flexibility or accommodation. Certainly within a long-term agreement, in my experience I've seen too, is there's some accommodation. We're not talking about risk right now because that's when certain parties put that in. That's discussions on how that's transferred and who does what, and the financial implications as well. But certainly there's certain things that can be met over time. Time sort of gives you some flexibility in a transition sense, so it's not like more immediate, but as long as something's in there that the party can be assured of. Oscar mentioned sometimes in some cases they're binding or non-binding. If it's not binding, then it's kind of, it almost is more symbolic and not much more than that. So the ones I was referring to, CBAs, are certainly binding and enforceable. Otherwise, there's not really much point in including them. You could just say, here's the intentions, but there will be no assurance in the future of that coming to fruition. I think it's there again, it's the people that really make it work, and really how you address all the parties and try to find out what the localized specific differences are that are not going to be as commonly viewed or shared. So it's really articulating that perspective well, so that there's an understanding, a clear understanding. I think that was mentioned early on in our webinar. You need to have a clear understanding, and then from there, you're going to have different viewpoints, but it's where you where you get from there to get agreement. It's like I said, it's never easy, but I'm always an optimist, and in my experience, it's being positive and always listening and understanding your party, and like I said, with Laurie's role too in the legal fashion too, because you're attaching to things that are very well legal things that are they can sort of hinge on to. So really, when it comes to negotiations, you've got to move from that sort of given position. So that's been my experience, but there again, it really depends on the situation and what you can really do to be creative, innovation, to introduce maybe different type of thinking that's normally just not directly associated, but getting buy-in from the parties to say we'll meet these goals. I mean, every situation is different, and maybe you can set another example, Laurie, or some things where there's been hard positions, maybe that there was finally give on one side, and it wasn't sort of obvious at the very beginning as apparent, because the focus was on a certain particular objective or condition. But I think thinking outside of that, so that's my experience.
Certainly, we did. Oh, go ahead.
It's fascinating in the sense that we talk about, often they talk about stakeholders and they confuse that with the partners of the SPV, but you can't ignore the surrounding stakeholders, the other jurisdictions, the other agencies, community groups and all of that, which are critically important to include as well. And Laurie, as you answer that question, the one thing that I also just wanted to add in, about the SPV, and maybe you can answer this as a lawyer, there's the special purpose vehicle, which is a ring-fenced legal entity that is set up to run the project. How do you do that when there are two countries involved in two different legal systems? Do you have a thought on that?
I do. I'll answer the first question.
Yes.
So what was done with the Gordie Howe, and this was my involvement with the Gordie Howe after I was not involved on the legal side anymore, but at the Cross Border Institute, which is a think tank that's housed at the University of Windsor, we were asked to do a study, an economic development study, not on whether or not the bridge needed to be built, but on the impacts and the needs of both countries, in Canada and the United States. And we did that project with Michigan State University, and we worked together. So Dr. Anderson, who's the director of the Cross Border Institute, Marta Lairdy Anderson, who's my colleague on the Otay Mesa project, who's the executive director, and she was the vice president of procurement at the Gordie Howe. So it's all really interconnected, but just to answer that question, what we did was we did roundtable after roundtable after, in the United States and in Canada, to say, what do you need as a logistics provider? What do you need as a mobile car wash unit? What does your business need? What do you need to be able to say, this project is something that would be good for me or my business? And so we were able to collate all of that information. The study's available on the website. I'm happy to share it, but it was a really different way of looking at it. So not just does the bridge itself need to be, or the project or the asset, but what is needed around it. And in these communities that did have certain needs that were very different from each other. So we were able to do head counts, labor counts, look at warehouses that were not being used, talk about how they could be repurposed for other uses. So I think there's a lot of ways to be creative, and that study allowed us to really take a deep dive into these surrounding neighborhoods around this future bridge. As to the SPV, same thing in the Gordie Howe, to that second part of your question, David, there is an international agreement that sits on top of everything else. And that international agreement is the one that takes into consideration the US perspective, the Canadian perspective, right? And then each country has its own, and then and they sort of fit together like a very complicated puzzle, if you will. But so part of having that ring around is having something on top that says this is what's going to govern it. So that's, and it's a multi-layered agreement, unfortunately, right? It's not one, but it basically refers to the other, and there are people who do that day in and day out, and that's not for me.
Thank you, Laurie. I have one last question, and this is most probably the last question because we are getting to the close of this session. Linda Nemec asked the question, there are common issues, and I know this definitely happens, on the Mexican border. It's rather dramatic, and it could happen on the Canadian border in the north west of the country. if there's a project and it's facing a risk from a natural event like flooding, big forest fires, droughts, and things like that, I suppose the question is, who's responsible for it, or how do you do it? And Oscar, you touched on that with the force majeure aspects on that. But just very quickly, Oscar first, and then very second, Laurie, and then we'll have to say our farewells because we are about out of time. Oscar?
That's a great question. Thank you, Linda, for asking that. The question is, are you building the project correctly, or you building the correct project? I think that's something that has to be done in the screening process to incorporate building the correct project, not building it correctly. And that involves the social factor and the resilient factors. Resilience, it has a cost because you have to incorporate certain add-ins to guarantee that that infrastructure is resilient against climate change. And that's moving forward, that's going to be something that's a given. That's why the ambition tool is very important. It actually forces you to ask those questions and makes you accountable. And I'm all for having everything legally documented and binding. I think that's something that's very important. They talk about that, especially with binational projects. Governance is the most important, how you set up the governance of this project. So I'll leave it at that, but definitely that's a good question. Moving forward, if you're not building a resilient project, you're not doing it correctly.
Because those factors don't respect borders. No,
Don't
they
respect borders.
Yeah.
And especially, that's
Okay.
important.
Yeah, Laurie, do you have a final comment?
Just saying, I think at least I've experienced it here, and it's when we're talking about the effects that the pandemic has had on the building of PPEs and getting people across and getting goods across, and again, something that nobody could have anticipated. And I've been involved on the periphery on some of that, and just seeing all of the right sort of key team players coming together to keep things moving despite such a natural obstacle that no one could have taken into consideration. So I do think it's all about being creative and innovative and collaborating.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give Wayne a chance, just any last comments, because we're about out of time. Any final words of wisdom from you, Wayne, on any topic? I'm leaving it totally wide for you.
Well, I guess if I had to sort of really quickly just comment on the sort of operational aspects. So I'm going to my FM background and the technical, which certainly ties into more closely with Oscar's discipline, Laurie's as well, but that's more on the project, getting it into place. But certainly analyzing and looking at why this has to be successful. It's one thing to build it, it's another thing to manage and maintain it over many years, and the risk that's inherent risk that's put in there. So I think it's really critical you have the right people right from the outset that are not looking at this from the perspective of how do we build this and do whatever to get it up and running, but it's long term. So the life cycle, there's a lot of things to really be considered. And I say that because a lot of, in technical sense, the technology impacts on methods and things which tie into Oscar's domain in engineering, but also on the facility side. You don't want to have something by the time you get approval and start getting all the agreements in place. 2 years later, you start to build it, and all of a sudden, some of these things are outdated. So you want to have flexibility with what you incorporate into your agreements, so that it's based outcome based. So you could have some flexibility within reason, obviously cost parameters and that sort of thing, to incorporate that in, and certainly take the long view of that. So.
Thank you very much. So we have about a minute and a bit, so I'm going to just say a few closing words. One thing that it was fascinating really to have good representation of two outstanding women professionals who are involved. It's good to hear that perspective, and I don't mean it in any condescending manner. I mean it as a wonderful opportunity for that voice. At WAPPP, we are very, very focused in giving women a voice, and that is critically important. And I know Maud has popped up, so I must have said something that excited her. Hi, Maud. But I know at the Global Infrastructure Hub that is also a priority. So thank you that we had a gender-balanced panel. That is wasn't just boring old gray-haired white men. It was different people as well. We are going to take this. This is not the end of it. We had a discussion with the Global Infrastructure Hub, but we're going to come up with a common post blog on this, where these ideas that have been shared can be carried further. I would encourage you to reach out to anyone who is on this panel if you have interests. And please, if you are interested from a PPP perspective of learning more and becoming part of an international forum, please consider joining WAPP. If you join WAPP, I know this is a North American chapter version, but you automatically join North America as well. You don't have to join a chapter. You can join the organization and enjoy the benefits of all. So thank you very, very much. I always get excited when I learn new things. People always ask me, what do I know about PPPs? And I say, I never know enough. And thank you, Maud. You gave me great ideas. Oscar, great ideas. Wayne, great ideas. Laurie, particularly from the legal side, which is a mystery to me, but without strong lawyers on these projects, they, I think, are in many cases going to be problematic and can fail. So have a wonderful weekend. Look out for future events. We do have a, WAPP itself is going to be doing an airport webinar next week, I believe it is. I've lost the message. There's so many things popping up on my screen, but please consider, if you are focused on aviation PPPs and that you can have a look at it. So I'm seeing here, I see here, there is a link, and if you go to WAPP's LinkedIn site, you can also see information on that. So I would say adieu, adios, goodbye, in many other languages. Have a great weekend. Thank you.